Hello, and welcome to How to Be a Better DM, a part of Session Zero Studios. My name is Tanner Wayland, and I'm going to help you take one more step on the journey to be the best DM you can be without, burning yourself out, losing the fun, or hurting any of the relationships around the table. And today we're going to be talking about campaigns. Which one's better, short or long? So when I say like a short versus a long campaign, I mean, is it a mini campaign? Can you finish it in, 10, 15 sessions, maybe even shorter? Kind of more of a mini story, but not quite a one shot, right? One shots, you can finish it in one session or maybe two if you decide to not do it all in 3 or 4 hours. A mini campaign to me or a short campaign, is going to be probably between like 5 to 15 sessions. Longer than that, we're going 20 sessions, 30, 40, more easily, depending on how often you can meet and everything. That's kind of the juxtaposition I want to bring up because they each have their own strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons, for what they can give more easily. Now, before I get into this, just keep in mind, you can tailor either a long campaign or a short campaign to be what you need, right? What your party needs in terms of variety, fun, type of story. There's a lot of flexibility as a DM. But beyond that, like, I think that each of them, like a short campaign, you'll be able to do some things easier than you could in a long campaign, and vice versa. So let's just launch into it. First, I'm going to talk about short campaigns, their pros and cons. Then I'm going to talk about long campaigns and the pros and cons of that too. And then something that I think is a nice middle ground if you're looking for it. But just to hop into short campaigns, variety. That personally, I find that to be one of the most enticing differences about it. Specifically, with a long campaign, it feels like you are kind of like, hey, it's one big story. It's going to have the same kind of themes, topics, feel to it. But with short campaigns, what you can do is be like, hey, this one, it's a heist. That's what it is. It's going to take a number of sessions, but then it's done. And then the next one could be like, oh, we're going to do a classic adventuring one. Oh, they meet up in an inn. They get a quest. They kill a monster. Done. And then the next one, you could do something wacky, like, oh, we're starting a bakery together. Our group of adventurers is starting a business, whatever it is, right? And they have to get the flour from the top of the mountain guarded by these beasts. And then they have to mill it and make it into bread. And there's going to be skill checks, right? My point is, there's a lot of variety built into the fact that you're doing little, like, kind of segmented chunks. So you can change them up. You don't feel like you have to keep it consistent. In order for it to feel immersive or to feel true to itself, right? And now another strength is that you're more likely to finish with a short campaign. I mean, how many campaigns has every DM ran that fell apart because someone couldn't be there, or someone, they lost interest eventually or something, right? Or life changes. With a short campaign, you are more likely to actually complete the story. And then it's also easier to even recruit players in the first place, because if they know that, like, hey, we're going to do this for a stretch of time, like once or twice a month for like 1/4 of the year, or like 3 to 5 months or something like that. You can kind of be like, hey, start date, end date. This is how often. Can you commit to that? And I think most people would be like, yeah, I can commit to that. And then, of course, because more people are able to commit, you're able to find more players, maybe some players who wouldn't usually play. But that's another nice thing just in terms of getting it started. And then when you're planning a short campaign, there's less to keep track of in the long term. In terms of just like, oh, you're not going to have a bunch of NPCs and have to remember their names from before, because you can kind of make it up. It's all a new adventure each time. New characters, new everything, right? So let's keep track of that way. However, on the con side, kind of a mirror of that last pro, because it is so new, there's a chance that your player characters, your players are going to miss their old characters. Further, they're going to miss maybe some of the development, because when you have a longer campaign, you can have certain NPCs be recurring characters, and they can be hilarious, or they can be serious, or they can be menacing, but they're recurring, and much like a stew that you got cooking for a long time, if you just are cooking something for a short time, it doesn't get the flavor, it doesn't develop that kind of depth. And to move away from cooking metaphors, basically, a shorter story means, you get what you get. It doesn't develop into something else in most ways, unless that's a part of the story and you can fit it into a short scope of the adventure. But that means that you could potentially just make it an interesting story to begin with and throw in a lot of twists and stuff, but you don't get that kind of natural change and progression. And as much as, some players really like making new characters, some of them are going to hate giving up on old characters that they got really tied to. And further, they might be mad that they can't level up that player and min-max them further, right? Some players, like Jake, who you've probably seen on this podcast before. He is the kind of person who has a billion characters. For him, mini campaigns would be great because he can just try a new character, because he's a forever DM, meaning that if he does get to play, it's rare, and so he has just a bunch of characters that he's made and he doesn't get to use. Whereas for me, I don't always make a new character, and so I kind of like having one character and building them out for a ways, and then starting a new one. So there's a little bit of nuance there and lost opportunity. But getting to so that's kind of like the short campaign, the mini campaign, the strengths with that. Basically, more variety and things like that. Now, another con that I forgot to mention is more prep. And this is going to kind of lead into a transition to talking about long campaigns, but an issue with short campaigns, it's the same issue with a one-shot, right? Unless you're replaying the same one-shot with different groups, that if you were to prepare multiple one-shots, let's say 3 one-shots, it would be a lot more preparation than doing the same amount of prep for one long campaign. Because one long campaign, it's like, hey, this is one overarching story, right? Overarching story. And so basically you just plan the world. You come up with general areas. You already know the big bad. You know maybe some of the groups in the area. And then it's a lot of prep up front, but then it's done. It's out of the way. You know what's in the world. And you can kind of just riff or plan smaller things from there to kind of fill in the little blank spaces you left. So long campaigns are actually, that's a big pro, is you do the bulk of the prep up front. The rest of the time, you can just do little touch-up preps, let's say. Coming up with an occasional new monster here or there, a new trap. But in terms of the main story points, you got that figured out. Whereas short campaigns, every time you have to plan you have to get the whole thing in hand, so to speak. So that's a con of a short, but a pro of a long campaign. We all have strengths and weaknesses as DMs, but that's why I appreciate our sponsor, Worldsmith.io. If you're not confident making a map quickly, use their map generator. Or maybe you're much better at making new characters than you are creating a new NPC or monster stat block. Don't worry about that either. It has separate generators for each of those. I even made an evil reindeer mini-boss for my holiday-themed campaign. The same is true for items, quests, traps, and more. Whatever you don't feel confident in creating, or whatever you don't have time to create on the fly, you can use Worldsmith.io's generators to bring your D&D campaign to the next level, which, as you know, is what our podcast is all about. Check out sessionzerostudios.com/worldsmith-podcast to learn more and support our show. Link is in the description. But jumping into long campaigns and why a lot of people love them and strive for them, despite the fact that it's hard on everyone's schedule. It's hard to keep people meeting for a long time. I mean, with a few exceptions, some people are really good at meeting for a long time. Uh, but, you know, but there's a reason why people keep trying it. And it's because the story and the development can get so deep and rich. For example, I mean, I'm guessing that if you listen to any actual play D&D podcasts or watch any channels online or anything like that, they probably aren't doing short campaigns. And it's because they're trying to make something deeper, richer. It has more depth of characters and also more recurring jokes and everything like that, right? And it also has a big finale. And that's the kind of thing that you can get with a long campaign because it's just more buildup. It's more effort. It's more work put into it. And instead of like, hey, we're going to try multiple stories to get variety, we're going to put all of our efforts and our time as a party and as a DM into one. And of course, that effort, it pays off. It sings at the end, right? And because of that, also the characters, like I don't know if your party is big into role playing, but I think even if they're lukewarm at it, a long campaign gives you, the DM, a chance to find out what their characters naturally seem to be interested in and tie that in so that they actually have a chance to explore that. And non-role players can suddenly be doing a lot more role play than they think, right? They can suddenly be like, oh, my character has NPCs that they're tied to in the past. My character has, family, has friends, it has past party members who have died and been switched out, right? As happens in campaigns. But that all becomes story, and they have to, they can reference that. And you can bring back NPCs and make them think beyond just the here and now in the story. Now, another aspect that players really like about a longer campaign, leveling. It means they get to that the higher levels that they never imagined. And frankly, even in a long campaign, I mean, so rarely do people get all the way from level 1 to level 20, but you're certainly not going to get there in a short campaign. In a long campaign, it happens, and it actually becomes a problem, as we'll talk about in a bit. But like, it is a great deal of excitement for your players to, see that incremental growth, and also to be able to spec out their character and get equipment and just eventually become OP. And they love that, right? Now, one kind of issue that I mentioned before with long games is that it's harder to get people together, or at least it's easier to get people together for a mini campaign. But with a long campaign, if you're able to get a group of people together who are like, hey, yeah, every other week or every 3 weeks or every month, I can block out this time, the last Saturday of the month or whatever, and we can play for 2 to 3 hours. Like, if you can get that core group of people together who can make that commitment, and it actually coalesces and happens, then that's so great. It means that you have a really close group of friends. And I love that. I love that about long campaigns, where not only are they developing a story, but they're also developing together. You're developing that friendship. So that's a great part too. Now, with all these pros, and of course I mentioned some earlier, like more prep at the start, but easier as you go along, grander story and consequences, things like that. Some of the consequences are, like I just mentioned, it's hard to get people together in the first place. And even if you do get people together, it might fizzle out, because the longer your campaign goes, the more likely that, someone has another kid and it just becomes a little bit too much for them or their partner, right? Or they have to move, or, other personal stresses, health issues, whatever it is. While it works sometimes to give them a hiatus, switch them out, or you have enough players that it's okay if someone takes a break. It's great if that happens, but more often than not, the other players kind of take that as a chance to be like, you know what? Yeah, let's take a break. And maybe the story doesn't end in the way you expected, which is a bummer, right? Like, It's a bummer, also a relief, but I think every DM, as much as they're relieved that like, oh, I don't, yeah, I have a little bit more time because I'm not prepping all the time for this. On the other hand, I mean, you kind of wish that you could. You kind of wish that you could finish it because you put all this effort in, and that's a bummer. I get it. But yeah, that's something to keep in mind is that the longer the campaign and the longer before you kind of close it off, close the story and start a new arc, the more likely that you'll never get that chance. But another issue with long campaigns is, and it's directly opposed to short campaigns. If you're not careful as a DM, a long campaign can start feeling very samey. Like as much as you're going to different cities and you're fighting different monsters and things like that, the tone and the general goals of the campaign can feel too railroaded. It can feel like, oh, we know what the big bad is. We know what the main goal is. We're saving this princess or whatever. And it feels like that's just, you're stuck on that. And the players, especially the ones who are maybe a little more straightforward and don't like doing their own fun little detours, they're going to be like, okay, next city, next boss, next dungeon. Let's just keep chug, like chugging along. But, that makes for a not very varied campaign. So I personally recommend if you do a long campaign, make sure to add variety in. Like I said with mini campaigns, how you can have one that's focused on being a heist. Throw a heist into your main story in a long campaign. Or allow certain players, like especially if their backstory is involved, allow them to take a tangent and to have a very different feel before you hop back onto the main quest. Things like that can add a lot of variety, and I mean, variety is the spice of life. And it's true for your players. They love it. You love it because you get to do something different, right? Now, one thing that players love, but that you won't love about long campaigns is getting OP, like just overpowered. Like they get items that they stack up, and then they, like, as they level up, they start doing more and more broken builds. That's very fun for players. As a DM, it's kind of rough because you start having to do more yourself. You start having to bring in monsters of a higher challenge rating that have legendary actions or more of them, or, traps that are like really deadly and just kind of confusing. You have to do more to make it challenging for the players. And that also means that combats and other things can just be a slog. Like it can just be so many different things that you're juggling at once. And that's kind of the weakness of a lot of these TTRPGs, especially ones built kind of around the same system as D&D. At the higher levels, there's so much to keep track of, and it's just one shots left and right because the monsters are just going at it. Like they've got breath weapons and they do a lot of damage and they have multiple actions. And same for your players. And you always have this feeling like you need to challenge them more. And it just means more on your plate. So keep that in mind as well. That, maybe you don't do a campaign that goes all the way to 20th level. Maybe you do one that gets to 15th, and that's like your limit. That's a, long campaign is good and fine and all, but nope, not 20th level long. I'm done, right? So keep that in mind. Keep in mind that the longer you go, the more you have to keep track of. It's always a challenge, but hopefully you've got patient players and hopefully you've got a good system for remembering everything. So I mentioned at the start that, these both have their strengths. And I'm sure that even if I've said this before, like told you about both of them, you probably already have your heart set on one, right? Either you're like, hey, I don't have a lot of time. All I do is short campaigns. Fine. Like most of the time people choose these things based on their life circumstances and if they have time, right? And people that do long campaigns, it's because that's what they've dreamed of for a while. That's because what they've seen like in actual plays online. They like the idea of the growing story. And so, honestly, what I shared today probably isn't going to dissuade you either way. But can I suggest maybe an in between for someone who, if you're a DM who finds that you always do the same thing, right? Either just short or just long. And I like to call it agile campaigning, right? Where it's a long campaign with the same characters, or, if someone dies or goes on a little trip, then one of the characters gets swapped out. But kind of like you're in the same world and, or, dimension hopping, whatever you want to do. And some of the characters get crossed between campaigns, but essentially you are making a long campaign that has many disparate parts. It's much more segmented. Maybe you're pulling in dungeons from different, sources that you've seen online, different adventure books, things like that. Maybe you're pulling that in and you're just pulling in sections. And by doing that, you're kind of forcefully making yourself add the variety that long campaigns can lack, frankly. But then at the same time, you get to bring the same characters through and have that major character development in those continued stories. It also means that you can take existing one-shots that you really like the idea of, and you can break them down, you can lengthen them out, you can plop in NPCs that have already been, discovered in your world. But basically, you're trying to make your long campaign as segmented and different along the way as possible so that you get the best of both worlds. So, it's more of an anthology game at that point, right? It's like, oh, we have the same cast of characters, different scenarios. And that's a great thing. And I think a lot of people do that already, which is great. But, just keep in mind that the way that you can get the strengths of both is by providing both positives in the same campaign, right? But hopefully I haven't talked your ear off. I'm passionate about this because I know a lot of times I've actually personally, just to share why I wanted to talk about it at the end of this podcast, I lean a lot towards mini campaigns because I've been in quite a few that never finished. And that's annoying because each time, while I've liked making new characters, I've had a couple characters that I actually think were pretty fun and they didn't get to continue because of the group split up. Life happened and that's normal. But if we were a little bit more flexible, maybe the DM even swapped out from time to time. Like, oh, it was the same campaign, same world, and the same understanding between players, but then, for each little arc, a new DM. So that some players could like leave for a sec, you could bring in some others. Basically, by making that kind of fluid player interaction, coming in and out of the campaign and new characters and different people DMing, you kind of it's almost like a tree getting new infusions of water, new grafting, new different kinds of things, right? You're breathing life into the campaign by making sure it doesn't stagnate, either because of content or players or DMs, right? So that's why I'm passionate about this. That's why I think that people need to consider short campaigns, but also consider maybe making their long campaign as flexible as the short campaign with some of the things I've talked about today. So keep that in mind. If you've had the same struggles that I've had with a long campaign, think about what I just shared. And for anyone who's done a long campaign and it feels like it's just so hard to get to the end of it, or players lose interest or whatever else, consider doing some of that agile campaigning I was talking about. I don't think that you'll regret it either. I think you'll really enjoy it, and it'll help you be a better DM in the future as well, because you'll think more about the type of content and the variety that you introduce. So go out there, try and change up how you run your campaign. Try and change up your thought process about campaigning as well. And until next time, let's roll initiative.
Brought to you by Session Zero Studios. For more information, visit sessionzerostudios.com.